Hi there, I'm Deep Dillon. Welcome to your AI Injection, the podcast where we discuss state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence with a focus on how these capabilities are used to transform organizations, making them more efficient, impactful, and successful. Welcome to this week's episode of your AI Injection podcast. I'm Deep Dillon. I'm a data scientist, co-founder at Xyonix, and your host. This week, we've got Bill, Constantine, and Carson Tussback, our regulars, to talk about how we can use AI to improve sports efficiency. So with that, Bill, why don't you kick us off a little bit? Tell us, I'm kind of like rewinding a couple of years ago when I think it was you that got really hot to trot on this idea, and tell us a little bit about the background that you had, because I think we all have sort of really connected with this topic over time.
Yeah, this was a really, really fun article to write and put together, and it came on the heels of some technology that Carson actually had shown to me as a computer vision guy. And so it marries artificial intelligence with sports, which is, I have passion for both. So it was really cool. And the backstory is that I, for some reason, am this masochist and sign myself up for marathons every now and again to keep from being really fat and getting out of shape. And so I've run quite a few marathons over my time. And during some of these marathons, and particularly one around the Seattle Marathon, I had really horked up my Achilles and, was quite injured for some time. And I was absolutely convinced that it was my running form that was the cause of it. And, when you look at like the typical person that runs a marathon and trains for a marathon, they literally, like on average, will run over like some enormous number of steps. I think I estimated at one point like 1.25 million steps when you're running. And if you have bad form, you can imagine that that's just a lot of extra stress on your joints and so forth. And so there was this idea in my head that, I could be a more efficient runner. And coupled with that was a little bit of an interesting thing going on. I have a daughter who played kind of elite soccer, and she had done so for years. And I literally had people come up to me after the soccer game or during the game and say, "Is that your daughter out there?" And I'd say, yeah. And she said, "Man, she's just beautiful to watch run." And it's absolutely true. She would just glide across the field. And when I would go running with her, she seemed like it was just effortless. I was like, what is she doing that I just can't quite grasp? And so,
yeah, I think that was when you started bringing up new terms that I hadn't really thought about, stuff like asymmetric gait and stride length, and a lot of kind of details in the running lexicon.
Yeah, when you're looking to optimize in a marathon, for me, I'm not like super fast, but you're looking to optimize the energy that you have and make yourself the most efficient. So there's like things that you try to do. There is this notion in the running community, for example, that if you run at a cadence, which is the number of steps per minute, of somewhere around like 180, then 180, 185, then that's sort of optimally efficient. After analyzing, by the way, sort of like Olympic style runners and so forth. Symmetry in motion is of course important, so that you're not overburdening one side or the other. And I don't know if you've ever watched these Olympic runners, now that I mention it, but their heads, they're just flying around like the track, but their heads, the vertical oscillation is pretty limited. They just seem to be putting all of their energy in a forward motion. So, in terms of things that I'm thinking about as a runner, I'm thinking about, okay, I got to get my cadence up, which I usually kind of suffer. I'm 6 foot tall, and I usually have slightly lower than that, like maybe in the 160s. Symmetry in motion is not something I really thought about until this exercise that we're going to talk about. And then vertical head oscillation, you can kind of feel yourself going up and down too much because you're standing, you're not leaning enough, you're spending too much time pushing upwards instead of forwards, etc. So there are those measures and quite a few others, but those are the things that I tend to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I've just got this image in my head. I don't know, everybody's seen this episode of Friends when I don't know, the character, the tall blonde one is out running. I'm imagining that this is most likely not what you're after, like that crazy spastic run, with the arms flailing and the head blobbing all over the place.
Yeah.
So with that, let's take a turn to the AI side. Like, what does artificial intelligence have at all to do with, with this, with an activity like running and improving its efficiency? Carson, you want to give us a little bit of a kind of background on what we mean when we say body pose estimation, and what it means to take just a video signal and like how can it give us a decent starting point for trying to help some of Bill's problems here on the running side?
Sure, sure. Yeah. So from my perspective, I actually came to this from a completely different angle. So one of my hobbies is computer game development. And if you look at animation in computer games, one of the things that it's hard. If you're not a professional animator, it's really hard to animate your own characters. But there's this thing called motion capture, right? And traditionally, that was done either with sensors that people would like have in a special made suit, or with markers on the body. So they would basically take visual markers like little tennis balls and glue them to your whatever you're wearing, at the ankles, at the knees, at the elbows, and at certain key points around your body. And then there would be like a trifecta of cameras that would just observe the actor, and based on the multiple camera angles, they would reconstruct your motion in 3D. And then when computer vision made some huge strides due to deep neural networks, it was actually possible to do this key point detection simply with convolutional neural networks. And that's kind of like how the pose estimation works. So we have these computer models that are trained basically to detect key points on the human body, like the knees, the elbows, the feet, key points of the face, the eyes, mouth, nose, etc., etc. And the first stage of these networks really does exactly that. It generates a heat map, given a computer image, a video image, the heat map of these key points, right? And then you can basically assume that these key points have a certain structure because they form a human skeleton. So you have some constraints. And given that, you can really resolve, okay, that must be the left knee, that must be the hip, that must be the elbow, etc., etc. And then the technology just simply advanced from there. And these days, we can do this in real time on our cell phones even.
I mean, I think, the first time you see these skeletons kind of moving around, based, kind of off of just a video signal, it sort of gives you, like for those of us who kind of think about what you can do with data, you sort of light up and you start thinking about, tracking these joints sort of individually, getting their natural signal patterns out. And then from that, maybe walking up and starting to do something like trying to measure, some of these pieces that Bill, you were alluding to. Bill, you want to talk us through, like, so what is your starting point with one of these kind of skeleton outputs? And then what are the problems that you're seeing to go from that to this kind of kinematics analysis that like ultimately answers a question like, what's your vertical head oscillation while you're running, or what's your stride length, or whether you're biasing, whether your left, ankle maxes out a little bit lower than your right ankle. Like, what is that kind of analysis you would do, and from what starting point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will answer that. I just want to take a brief moment to say how far we've come with this technology, in the sense that it's now mobile and available to all people, essentially. Because when you think about what Carson was saying, the ability to hook yourself up with sensors and monitor these your activity, that typically is leveraged by professional sports teams, college teams, not necessarily the average Joe out there running. So
yeah, I mean, I remember that, I think it was, and this might be dating me a little bit, but I think it was like 1995, the first time I went to SIGGRAPH, which, for those who don't know, this is like this massive graphics convention where the whole animation industry is at. And I remember being there and just being wowed by, these contraptions inside of, like kind of instrumenting these actors and actresses. And they were, they're like in all kinds of motion. And then meanwhile, you've got these 3D puppets, kind of running around. I think this was even pre-Pixar, back then. That obviously is an expensive proposition, to instrument every elbow, every shoulder, every knee, every wrist, every ankle. And so you have a different set of business realizations that can come from that expense. But now we're talking about, I think it was Apple now has body pose extraction in the iOS, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, I mean, total agreement that we've come a long way there.
Game changer. And when you think about this particular problem, now all of a sudden let's go back to my daughter and me and think about how this is going to play out. I basically said to her one day, he's like, look, let me show you this pose estimation stuff that Carson showed to me. And she's like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. And I said, grab your running stuff, because we're going to go out to the park. And what we're going to do is I'm going to prove to the world that you're a better runner than I am. She's like, okay, well, I already know that. And I said, yeah.
She's like, I know
right.
that.
That's right. I know that you know that. But I actually, so I'm a scientist, Emma, and I want to prove it to myself. And also maybe I'll find something new, So how I set up the problem is I did constrain the problem to be pretty easy peasy lemon squeezy. I had my wife basically take my iPhone and have it aimed at a fence that I in front of her in mostly an orthogonal 90-degree view, 90-degree angle. And then essentially I just ran across the screen quite a few times and had her record me and then separately record my daughter. And then I took that video then and I used pose estimation to frame by frame identify those key points on the body. And now I want to take those key points, and as Carson said, it's a constrained relationship. Hopefully your nose is somewhere close to your ear, and your elbow is somewhere not close to your ankle, and so forth. So you can develop these skeletons that are overlaid on the body as you go about your motion. So kind of the first order of business is, well, I had these metrics in mind that I mentioned before. I want to see what my metrics are in terms of cadence and symmetry in motion and my vertical oscillation. And I want to map from these key points that I see on every image to these guys. Well, how do I do that? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to have some reference in the image about going from the number of pixels that you see, say from the ankle to my nose. I know how tall I am and I know that distance, so I can get a pretty good estimate if I'm standing straight up of how those pixels, the number of pixels that are identified in the image, scale to my actual height. And so prior to doing this, we did kind of like a normalization thing where we just stood there and at the depth that we were going to be running by the camera and got that measurement so that I could make that transformation. So that allows us to go from the pixel domain to the real world coordinate domain. And now once you have those, you can form these things called kinematics. For example, I can take the position of things frame by frame over time, and I can convert the position of, say, my elbow or my nose into velocity. And so what you're actually pulling out are sort of signals, what they call time series, which are a series of positions over time for your different parts of your body. And you can form things like, what's the vertical velocity component of my nose? And I use that as a proxy, for example, of the vertical oscillation in my head. I basically form positional and velocity coordinates. And now you have those in place, and the next thing is you fill in the blanks for whatever measure that you're trying to accomplish. So the vertical oscillation in the head was pretty easy. I just found the peak, sort of my peak amplitude going up and down in that waveform, and use that as in comparison to Emma. The symmetry in motion thing was a bit interesting. Based on the observation of the videos, which we have in our article online, by the way, you can see that at Xyonix.com, Xyonix.com. And you're going to want to look up using AI to improve sports performance there as one of our blogs, and you can see this video in action. But I noticed that my right ankle was going up much higher than my left. And while Emma's was perfectly level with it. So her ankle was, her stride, essentially, her vertical oscillation was at the same as her right as was her left. And so I measured the deviation from the peak amplitudes of the right and left as a means of measuring symmetry. And then cadence is just something that you back out, is how many times you land your foot your feet in 1 minute, and that's something you just have to pull out in terms of that's like a time series analysis problem.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of words to say. There's sort of these basic steps. It's not necessarily simple. You got to clean up the data a bit. You basically pull out the time series, and then you analyze the time series to get the metrics. Now that you have those metrics, those are a measure of your performance. And the spoiler alert here is that it turns out that Emma in all of these metrics was better than I was, and I proved to myself and the world that she was better than I was. All along, she knew this, but so that was interesting.
You're listening to Your AI Injection, brought to you by Xyonix.com. That's Xyonix.com. Check out our website for more content, or if you need help injecting AI into your organization. Yeah, so I noticed, like, I remember when you did that first analysis and we looked at those results, we were like, this is like a very powerful concept here. Take, a phone in someone's pocket, point it at a person, and get this incredibly historically expensive analysis results, and for improving sports efficiency. But also, I started thinking a lot about it from a sports medicine vantage. What happened for me, and this is like the story of Xyonix fathers and daughters. But my daughter, I think right around this time, had she's like a pretty intense soccer player, and she had torn her ACL. She was about 14 at the time. She tears her ACL. She gets the surgery. She goes through it, and now she had a good 9 months from when she could kind of walk and get moving to when she wanted to get back on the soccer field. And I was at her physician's, at her orthopedic surgeon's clinic, and we actually kind of had really intentionally chosen this physician because my daughter did not want to get her ACL repaired by somebody that didn't know how to get you back on the field and into sports in an intense way. So this physician is located underneath Husky Stadium. And so you walk in and it's like a really dramatic setting. She focuses on not just Husky athletes, but like other, pro sports. I think the Seahawks and some other folks down there. So I'm in there and I'm chatting with her, and I looked and I said, "Hey, I noticed you've got this room that's just tricked out with all of these sensors. There's like all kinds of, stuff. Like, how do your patients all go in there?" And she's like, "Oh, I wish all my patients went in there. That's only for the UW football team players. They get to go in that special room, which is, expensive." And I started looking, poking my head around in there, and I was thinking, like, why, meanwhile, every once in a while I'm at my daughter's physical therapy, and I'm looking around and I'm like, this whole place just seems like it's stuck in the 70s. You get this Xerox photocopy, that comes out that gives you your exercises. You have this, fairly, this person that's like kind of watching you do, your experiments, but there's like a one-to-one relationship. There's got to be some way to capture more of what's going on with those elite football players in that elite room to get them rehabbed than just, this kind of slow kind of process of the physical therapy. And can we start to like maybe do a different activity? So like not just, let's say, the running efficiency, but can we now assess, because like walking gait was another important metric. There was all kinds of stuff that the PT was looking at with respect to like, hey, can she keep her knee super straight while she's trying to re-strengthen, or while she's doing these lateral exercises? So we started expanding our thinking, a little bit on how we could extend this activity analysis. And I think the soccer stuff kind of peaked when we said, well, hey, let's pick another problem, very different, from running. But can we do something like where we can actually map things into the real world coordinates? And I think that's when we started gathering video footage of somebody kicking a penalty kick, and we started tracking everything on the goalie and the keeper. So maybe you want to walk us through like some of the differences, from the keeper versus the running, and some of the similarities. Like, what are all the things that we could do as we started walking up the stack there?
Yeah, definitely. We both had that soccer connection through our daughters, and it was thinking about, how do you take this really cool thing that we just did with running and apply it to some other area? We had this mobile lab, essentially, as you indicated, not confined to the University of Washington center, but out there in the real world. Well, we can take this out there and say, what if we just, for example, we're looking at the efficiency of a goalie? Like, what does it mean to be a good goalie and not a good goalie? Obviously, a good goalie who blocks all of the balls coming his way is a great goalie, right? No matter what. But how does that great goalie achieve this? And when you think about, when I looked at these runners just observationally, it's very easy to see that these people are just much different than you are, and you want to capture a bit of that magic. And I think that this kind of system allows that to happen, where we can take goalies that are like really, really good at what they do, record them, start to get an assessment of these kinematics that they display. Maybe some physical properties, like, is a good goalie immediately tall? Like, he's got to be like 6'10", or are goalies that are a bit shorter, are they also efficient? How quickly
maybe she's got a better vertical jump, or a more like, or maybe she's like, you got the penalty kick, because we were studying it in the context of the PK.
Yeah.
But, maybe she's like committing a little bit earlier, and just
that's right.
Watch it frame by frame. Yeah, one of the things that that we did during this this period is we talked to a lot of folks who actually do this for a living, and I remember talking to a gym, like a rehab kind of a performance optimization center, and I can't remember exactly where they were. I think it was somewhere in the South, but these folks would sit down and take this high frame rate photography of elite athletes. So these are like the Michael Jordans of the world, not even like a UW Husky varsity football player, but like the elite of the elite. And this group would study them and study the exemplars like the Michael Jordans, and basically like come up with really specific differences between what they were doing and what the athlete aspiring to be the next elite athlete was doing in their studio. And they were studying and kind of looking at a lot of the kinds of things that we're seeing and able to isolate from the skeleton and the kinematics extraction on top of that, and so I mean, you kind of back to the penalty kick scenario. So what were the some of those things that that you might be looking at if you're studying an elite athlete or somebody who wants to be?
Yeah, certainly in that process of having the camera mounted behind the penalty person taking the penalty kick, we have the sense of timing, the reaction time we can gather. So we know when the ball, for example, is left to turf by way of some other types of image processing magic that we can do. So we can start the clock essentially as soon as that ball leaves the surface. Now, how is that mapped to the goalie's movement? Is he also leaning in a particular direction when that comes about? And what is his vertical leap capabilities? It's funny that you mentioned that, because I think in the video that we processed, the thing that struck me about this visually was that our goalie didn't have much of a vertical leap, and I think he ended up being scored on there. So could you take that information? I mean, certainly that might be something you can just observe. You don't need to have special pose estimation to be able to figure that out, but you might be able to optimize his vertical leap, like how far he's squatting down.
Well, it's funny funny that you mentioned that about vertical leap, because we had a pro football team, director of their analytics that we were working with, and one of the things that I didn't realize that happens with with pro sports teams is similar to when we were talking about the video gaming where these actors and actresses are like kind of instrumented like with these really expensive instruments. Players are usually instrumented, particularly pros players. There's a lot more budget for that. But one of the things that happens with these pro players is they walk through the locker room and they get these quick assessments. And one of the assessments they get is their vertical leap, and they use a classic force plate where which I don't know if I actually didn't know about it before kind of digging in with this sports team analyst, but they basically stand on this plate. The plate has sensors in just the floor. They're on their feet. They jump up, and it can kind of measure their sort of acceleration, their deceleration. It can even measure the contact with the surface. But what it can't do is like, place, like have a full view of the body. You can't comment on the knees, the shoulders, the wrists, the heads. And so one of the things these, these folks were interested in was like, hey, sometimes these pro athletes, they just want to get back on the field. They might have like a really subtle issue with the recovery from an ankle or a knee, injury. And now, we want to be able to tell that they're kind of like schmoozing us, like they're just trying to get past the force plate, because we're like, no, you got to, we're going to, you're going back to PT with you or whatever.
Yeah.
And so we were kind of, setting up the cameras, because one of the advantages in that context is, as one of the problems I'd like us to talk about a little bit is the camera positioning at some point, because that is a challenge. In this particular context, it's not, because every day the force plate's in the same place. All 80, or I actually don't know the number of players in an NFL team roster will kind of come through, and you got like, 20, 30 seconds with each player. They get on this plate, they jump, but having the cameras like right there, waist high, pointed right at it, being able to get, like the full activity analysis that, we're able to do, suddenly became a game changer, for these folks. So back to
we had a orthogonal views. We had the front view, we had the side view. Did we have the top view? I think, I don't quite recall, but you're right. We had these, these different. Yeah.
The key is that you can so this is one of the challenges with this stuff, right? Is that where do you put the cameras, right? So like, with the keeper scenario, you could imagine you're in training, you got a camera like right by the keeper, the distance from the PK, ball placement point to the goal, the dimensions of the goal, so you can map everything into real actual coordinates. Talk to us a little bit about that process, because I know that was an exciting moment for us when we were able to go from like, oh, your head's just moving around, X pixel differences, compared to like, hey, we know exactly what your acceleration of your left wrist is going for, a crossover reach to a ball in the upper right, part of the goal.
That's now you're reminding me, because it has been some time since I thought about that. But yeah, one of the things we did was also to monitor the velocity of the wrist and the hands as they, and sometimes if you think about your first jump, first of all, I did an assumption there to get to your question specifically. I assumed, I made an assumption to sort of make the problem a little less difficult in terms of these coordinates. I assumed that the goalkeeper was jumping within the plane of the goal. And so if you were to basically cover the goal with a giant sheet, that he was jumping basically along that plane of that sheet. And so that we do know that the standard width and height of those goalposts, and so we could use that as again another means of mapping from the pixel domain, how many pixels we can count in the horizontal direction and the vertical direction, to what that means in the real world for that person. Because there's a perspective, obviously, right? We all are familiar with perspective when we look at railroad tracks, how they converge in the distance to a single point. So we have to take that perspective into our calculations when we talk about real world coordinates. And of course, the person kicking the ball, who's very close to the camera, he lives in a sort of he's part of that perspective. So he appears much larger than the person in the background. So you have to take into account perspective. But yeah, that was a really cool, very interesting thing. I was just dying to maybe go off to my favorite MLS team and show this type of analysis and see the types of things that they look at, because they certainly are, all of these professional athletes are definitely mic'd up and spiked up in order to measure this stuff.
So another thing that happened that, is we were working with, at one point, we were working with a couple of ex-physicians that sort of had created this company where they were doing something that's kind of very straightforward for AI. And Carson, I want you to explain this a little bit in just a second here. But one of the things they were doing is they take the outlines of a major league baseball pitcher, and they would sort of painstakingly cut the outlines of the pitcher out, reassemble a video of the pitch during games for these pitchers, and then present that to the pitching coaches of Major League Baseball teams and other teams. One of the things that that's caught our eye was like, hey, and one of the reasons they do that apparently is like, it's really valuable to like take away all the visually distracting information, like, the fans waving stuff and, and all of the other kind of motion on the field, but get down to just the actual motion. And this goes back to what we were saying before about this other, this other kind of elite athlete kind of assessor, performance obsessor, but, being able to like study it almost frame by frame. So we thought with the same, penalty kick scenario that we would do something similar. And again, part of the goal here is like to walk down from professional athletes and all of the expense of custom sensors and, and having it be cost effective even to have someone painstakingly cut things out frame by frame. So we tried to do that automatically, thinking we can push some of this capability all the way down into like, amateur athletics, like our daughters are involved with. Carson, you want to talk a little bit about, what kinds of models are capable of cutting out, like a person's contour or shape, in a video, and like how we went about kind of, or how we typically go about using that and applying it in this kind of soccer scenario.
Yeah, so that's a process called semantic segmentation, and it's kind of related to object detection. In the early days, we would do object detection by drawing rectangles around, let's say, the ball or the player, and we would train these models to detect basically where in the image the ball is or where in the image the player is. And then, once again, with the advent of deep convolutional neural networks, we took that a step further, and we're not training on rectangles around the object, but the concrete outlines. And these models are then actually completely able to not just detect where the object is, but really detect the outline. There's a couple of problems with it. So one problem is that it's really expensive to train these models, because while you don't have to like mark key points in your training data or rectangles, you literally have to have somebody very carefully trace the outlines of the objects, and that is the training data for these networks. And so unless you're working with something that is well known or has been well explored, like people or common objects, if you want to do a custom model, it can be very, very expensive to generate these training sets that you need. And the other problem is it's not perfect. When you do this with video, you will notice that there's a little bit of jitter. So basically, the outline is not really totally exact, but there's a couple of pixels difference usually. And so you have these blobs that wiggle a little bit when you do this. But in general, it works really, really well.
Perhaps you're not sure whether AI can really transform your business. Maybe you don't know what it means to inject AI into your business. Maybe you need some help actually building models. Check us out at Xyonix.com. That's Xyonix.com. Maybe we can help. Yeah, that's that is something you notice when you look at the semantic segmentation, that it's got its own view, and it feels like it's going to be a ways before we get those perfect, all the way down to the pixel level. But the trajectory of the improvements that we're seeing, is kind of clearly in place.
Yeah, I have a question I'd like to. So, Karsten, I think from what you said there, it's nice to point out something that you mentioned. That is, let's say I am fascinated with all this technology, but I want to apply it to my horse or my dog. Can I take one of these models trained up on a human and just apply it to those? I mean, I kind of know the answer to this, but I wanted you to speak to it.
With less effort than doing it from scratch, you can. Yeah, you can do something that's called transfer learning. So let's say you have an object that has been trained to recognize people, right, and cars, let's say, but you want to apply it to something the model has never seen before, like dogs. Then you can actually use the base net that was trained on people. It has learned like a lot of the rudimentary elements that images and contours and shapes are built out of, and then you're able to provide a smaller training set with your custom objects, and simply kind of fine-tune that network towards your custom objects. And it will perform really well because it has kind of like trained these or learned these elementary visual elements beforehand. And so you need much less training data. But you still need to supply a couple hundred samples, and hopefully then you can recognize your own objects.
That's really cool. So we can transfer this to other domains, and that's a great aspect of I always loved about working with these images, is this transfer learning concept, where somebody out there spent a lot of time and effort to build a deep learning convolutional neural network where they took the time to create all that wonderful training data, but we can actually use that to be able to apply it to other domains with just a little bit more effort. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the questions I'll kind of throw out there is like, what is there that you can use some of this body pose estimation like outside of the sports arena? I mean, sports is and one of the cases that comes to mind is, I know we've been working with a client that's automatically trying to assess autism spectrum disorders in infants, for example. So the body pose data that we're sort of generating and using to get the skeletons on fully, like full adults is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily work quite as well on these kind of cute, pudgy little creatures. Carson, do you want to talk about maybe some of the, like, what are some of the challenges in just getting the skeleton itself, out and kind of really effective, in some of these scenarios where it's a baby, it's a horse, it's a dog, like it's something different.
Well, yeah. So what I mentioned in the beginning, the whole principle behind these techniques is key point detection, right? And the nice thing about human bodies is that the key points you need to model the skeleton are often very distinct. The knees, the ankles, the feet, et cetera. And depending on where you want to transfer and apply that, the key points might be not so distinct. Like you said, babies are a little bit more pudgy, and it's not so super clear when they're crawling around where the elbow is. And so the model has a harder time to learn these and adjust to these, especially if they're ambiguous. And so depending on what your constraints are and how distinctive the key points are, it might be difficult for you to follow the same principles to train such models. An example that we did, for example, was that we applied this to surgical instruments in laparoscopic surgeries. We were interested in kind of like the same principle, how the surgeon is moving these robotic instruments, with what accuracy, with what speed, were they very careful, were they not careful, did they perform their suturing correctly? And so this was about motion analysis and activity analysis based on instrument movement. And we did the same thing. We followed the same principles. We trained basically key point detectors on very important key points in these instruments. But often you would have like a long shaft of the instrument that is no distinguishing or no standing out sections. One looked like the other. And so at that point, it becomes really, really difficult to train key point models.
So we got pretty inspired here, between Bill's kind of initial foray into running, kind of digging in on the soccer side, helping out, with this autism project, some of the surgical stuff that we started. We ended up actually putting together, an activity analysis platform where we said, look, somebody's probably going to have a device. They're probably going to be sitting on an iPhone or an Android device. They can capture the video, send it up, generate an analysis, like send it up, get the body pose extracted either on device or up in the cloud, and then be able to get these kind of kinematics kinds of analysis, Bill, that you were describing earlier, and get that down, back onto device to kind of, generate a report, or present some sort of specialized feedback back. We actually, went ahead and kind of put that together, and so it's now pretty straightforward for us to like map a new activity into this infrastructure, and that's kind of an exciting outtake. I know there's a lot of folks out there that have been kind of like scratching their heads on what they could do with body pose. One of the challenges, though, is you have some of these obfuscation issues where something gets occluded, occlusion issues. You also have the kind of challenges around camera placement. Do you guys want to maybe chat a little bit around, around some of those problems and kind of mitigation strategies? Or
so Carson, I'd like to go first on this one, just something kind of obvious, and I'm going to speak to something in terms of time series analysis. Sometimes these key point detectors are errant. Suddenly, the right elbow becomes the left elbow, and so forth. And so within one individual frame, which is essentially one point on the screen, you can't really do much about that. But when you collect all the points across time, you'll see an obvious blip. Like, for example, my vertical head motion went from, being down at like, say 6 feet off the ground to all of a sudden 20 feet off the ground, or 3 inches off the ground for just one point. So you can, in terms of there's a time series analysis approaches or means that you can detect these obvious errors and just simply fill them in with something you think is reasonable. So in terms of sort of corrections there, you can do so with some sort of visualization of these key points across time and fix them accordingly. Okay, now Karsten, you go.
Yeah, those are the perils basically working with almost live data. You just have to have these sanity checks in there, right? Just like you just mentioned. The other thing that's really important is calibration. If you really want to, and you talked about that a little bit, Bill, but if you really want to derive physical measurements out of this, like velocity or movement speeds, and you have to have some reference in your image. And so the camera becomes really important. You need to have some reference object or points in your image. For example, in your running demo, Bill, the fact that you guys were running in front of a fence is great, because you can measure the fence, and you can even not just measure relative velocities, but also absolute velocity in your scene, because you have that static thing in your scene. And so if you set up an experiment, you always want to have something like that in your view, in your scene. You kind of want to know the camera model, what's the focal range, et cetera, so you can make really good sense out of those physical objects you have there, your reference objects. Because without that, all you can measure is relative motion, right? You could measure how fast are your hands moving in relation to your spine, and you can derive some good stuff from that, but you won't get any absolute metrics.
Yeah, that's a good call, Karsten, because I remember when we did the football analysis, we did have a lot of those references as well. So we definitely needed that. Yeah.
And the other thing that Deep mentioned, the occlusion, that is really important. The running demo worked really well because you're essentially moving in a plane. And the same thing is true with the goalie if you ignore the fact that he might actually jump forward or backward. But the moment that you have motion that is not in a plane, that is orthogonal to your camera, you need more cameras. You basically need to have multiple views in order to kind of like reconstruct the motion in 3D space, and then things get more complicated.
What I always thought was fascinating was this occlusion when it came to how well I thought visually these models perform for pose estimation. I've seen a lot of examples of it where people are dancing, for example, in a group. And you see, they naturally turn their heads, say one way or the other, or turn their bodies. But there really are mapping where the locations of these key points are in a 3-dimensional space. And they tend to do fairly well. So they must have had tell me a little bit about what that might have involved, Karsten, from a training perspective, maybe with the data, or do you have to do something special with the models for that? How does that work?
If it is really like a 2-dimensional image and the construction was from one single scene, then it's just a visual effect. There's no way to reconstruct 3D information unless you have cameras that also give you depth information. There's some cameras out there that do that. For example, the Kinect, right? Yeah. So if I have depth information in addition to my optic information, I can derive the 3D locations. If I don't have that, then it remains a guessing game. Once again, because humans and human skeletal motion is very constrained, you can play a pretty good guessing game, right? Because arms don't twist certain ways, and so you can optimize things that way. But
that's what I was wondering, whether it was, as you say, essentially a guess on the annotator's part, the person actually labeling these joints for training, or whether they brought in some sort of physical constraints, knowing that they're dealing with human beings. Maybe it's a combo of those things.
To solve the real problem, you need at least stereoscopic vision, so at least 2 cameras Ideally more, so you don't have to deal with occlusion effects.
Yeah.
All right, Bill, one last final question before we wrap it up here. Did it work? So you got this analysis for your running, you found out your head's bobbing around too much and one of your ankles was kind of not moving up as much as your other. What did you do about it? And are you a better runner than your daughter now?
I'll answer.
You started playing golf, right, Bill?
You switched sports.
That's right. I started gambling and playing golf. I mean, that seemed to be not the natural out of this. I will tell you something. It did help me. I'm fortunate enough to have a very supportive family. When I go on these massive training runs, I usually don't want to lug around a bunch of water. I'm spoiled, right? I'm a prima donna runner. I don't want to lug all my stuff around. So I begged and asked my wife or my kids, would you ride alongside me with your bike and maybe give me some water and so forth? But knowing that I was actually seeing myself in the video and being able to quantify how particularly my right leg was asymmetric from my left leg, I had my wife take further video of me. And what's really great about this is you want to do this type of stuff when you're tired. When you're not tired and you're just starting off a run, you tend to do great with your form, right? But we all know when you get tired, you break down. So basically the task that I asked her to accomplish was, I want you to take some video of me and also just visually assess me, like 10 miles into this run, because that's when I'm going to be tired and that's when I start messing up. And so, without seeing this video, without doing this analysis, I would not have detected this issue. I just didn't feel it deep when I was out there running. And so it allowed me to hone in on it and quantify how bad it was, and then measure it later and see that I was doing better when I was tired. So that it definitely helped me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. That's fantastic. That's all, folks. Thanks, Bill and Carson, for a robust and fun conversation. That's the end of this episode on improving sports efficiency by using AI. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have some articles on this topic, actually quite a bit of content on related to this topic on our website. So if you're interested, any of our listeners, in reading more, go to Xyonix.com, Xyonix.com. You can check out our articles, or you can go to one of our body pose solutions. Thanks everybody for sticking around, and we will see you next time on your AI injection. That's all for this episode. I'm Deep Dillon, your host, saying check back soon for your next AI injection. In the meantime, if you need help injecting AI into your business, reach out to us at Xyonix.com. That's Xyonix.com. Whether it's text, audio, video, or other business data, we help all kinds of organizations like yours automatically find and operationalize transformative insights.